There's
Right.
been a lot of talk. Israel apparently has not seen this MOU at all, and yet according to word on the street, leaked documents, quote unquote, how verifiable those are, we're not sure. But according to these leaked documents, it looks like part of the agreement will be that Israel will have to withdraw from Lebanon and a whole bunch of other things. But even today, I believe Iran was threatening that if Israel doesn't stop its attacks in southern Lebanon, that it is going to retaliate. Do you think that that could be a point at which this whole thing could break down?
But if anyone thinks that Israel is controlling President Trump right now or is pulling the strings of American foreign policy, the last couple of weeks is a pretty clear indicator that that could not be farther from the truth.
Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee, here with my co-host, Olivia Lane. Today is Wednesday, and I've forgotten the date, honestly. I think it's June 17th today. It's good to be back. We've actually been off for a little while. You'll forgive me for forgetting the date because we've been out of rhythm for a bit. We were, both of us, actually in Israel. Olivia is still there. I've since come home after a few adventures. We took some time off, however, because we were there with students. And it also happened to be a slightly more exciting season than usual with a few fireworks, courtesy of Hezbollah and Iran. Thank you very much. And we figured now is a good time to get back into this. And before we jump into all of our usual subjects and debates about what's going on over there, it might be nice to actually take a step back and sort of recap a little bit what it was like visiting Israel with students in the midst of everything going on there right now. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is the latest regarding this Iran deal, this mysterious Iran deal that maybe has been signed, maybe not. Who knows what it says? We'll find out. Lots for us to talk about. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Olivia, I'm going to start with you. I think I really wanted to spend a little bit of time before we get into all of this Iran business talking about what it was like actually being there with students. I think we sometimes take for granted that kind of opportunity, especially in the middle of conflict, that students would be willing to travel there is actually a big deal. We really, I think, are very impressed with those students and appreciate them. And it's a good time to talk about, what was our favorite part of that experience. So I'll let you go first.
Yeah, it's so cool. We've had a few days, I feel like, to sort of decompress and think about everything. And there were so many highlights of the trip for me. I'm sure you had the same experience. There's so many different people and different personalities, and just I never want to take for granted the fact that we get to go and watch other students fall in love with Israel. It's just the coolest thing to be a part of, especially with everything that's been going on for the last several years. Having students that are willing to come when things are the way that they are is not something that I know you and I do not take that lightly. And so there were so many favorite parts, but I think one of my favorites was on Shabbat, we were walking. I can't remember if it was either to or from the Western Wall, and some of the soldiers had just gotten done with their swearing in ceremony at the Kotel. And, it was a bunch of young soldiers, and their families were all there, and it was very packed and very chaotic. And one of these moms of these soldiers had made a bunch of food and just brought it for her and her family. And I was walking with the Young Women of America bus, and we were walking down this little street, and this mom just came up and gave us the food that she had prepared because she saw a group of young ladies, and she had all this extra food to give, and she thought that we were just perfect for it. And so she just handed it out to us, and she didn't speak any English, but she just was so happy to give these young girls this food that she'd made. And I don't know why that moment just stuck out to me so much, but I think part of it just has to do with the fact that that is such a daily experience of living in Israel and what it's like to be here in this country. And sometimes just with the busyness of trips and the hecticness of the schedule, students sometimes don't get to experience those small, more intimate moments. But it meant so much to them to they were like, what the heck? This is so amazing that this woman just like gave us this food that she made herself and she didn't have to. And they lit up and they love it so much. And that was definitely a highlight for me, just to like watch that experience and watch them get to participate in that. And I don't take it for granted at all. But I would love to know what your favorite experience was too, because we interacted with each other a little bit on the trips, but there was so much going on that I know I didn't really get a long time to like sit down with you and talk and debrief. So I'd love to know what yours was too.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It was a little harder to spend time with the groups this time because I had other meetings or projects I was working on at the time. I think one of the things that was really quite a lot of fun that obviously we didn't get to do with everyone else was some filming at the City of David. So I look forward to sharing more about that project as that footage becomes available and as we edit that into some pretty great videos, I think. But some of the things that did stand out when I was with students or with the rest of our team in Israel, it's always, I think, amazing to see friends and colleagues. Part of what makes Israel so, I think, special to people who, like us, work for Passages or work in the space, is that you develop a relationship with the place and the people over a period of many years. My first trip to Israel was now almost exactly 10 years ago. So I've spent a decade building relationships there that are very meaningful. And it's always very special to get to go back and see some of those people. In this case, I was able to spend a little bit of time with the person who was the tour guide on my very first trip to Israel. So that's just one example of some nice little moments I was able to have during the course of the trip. It's also, I think, really powerful seeing students experience things for the first time. When you go to Israel enough times, at a certain point, you can begin to lose a little bit of perspective. I mean, this is going to sound strange, but after a while, even some of the really unique holy sites begin to look and feel familiar and almost as if you can take them for granted. When you watch students as they're walking through those sites for the first time, however, it's a really powerful reminder that these sites have just an incredible story to tell and that it can leave a deep imprint on you even in just a few days. And I think for me, it's very heartwarming to be reminded of that and be able to sort of reimagine these sites through their eyes and experience it all over again. The last thing I'll say is that I don't always get to have private moments when I'm there at these sites because I'm staffing a trip with students and there's a lot going on, lots to take care of. But at each holy site, I typically would like to try to get just a few moments. And I was able to this time at the Garden of Gethsemane. That was really, I think, something that I enjoyed a lot because it provided an opportunity to just sit for a few minutes to pray and reflect on the weight and the intentionality of the choices that Jesus had to make that night in the Garden of Gethsemane, especially as you're sitting in the shadow of the Temple Mount and understanding and reflecting on really the tremendous burden of the sacrifice that he was going to make. Very powerful. And so I really appreciated a few moments here and there where I could also take some time to pray and reflect. Olivia, I want to ask you as well, what stood out to you the most in terms of, did you learn anything during these trips? You, of course, basically live in Israel now, so maybe this is a little bit less relevant for you. But in my case, because I'm still a visitor when I go, I find that every time I'm there, I'm learning something new. So I'm curious if you have any highlights from the trip as far as something new that you learned, maybe.
Yeah, I think one big thing that, you and I both agree that we don't take this job for granted, being able to watch students experience this. But I think especially after October 7th, like we don't take any of that for granted. And I think, it's very easy living here to sort of just like get into the rhythm of things and sort of keep your head down. There's like always something happening here. But then when you're with students, like you mentioned, you're watching it through this sort of different lens because they're experiencing everything for the first time. Like I remember I don't remember where we were walking. It was somewhere like that to me, like you said, just felt very familiar. And I was kind of in the back of the group and one of the students turned to the other one and mouthed to them. They were like, "This is so cool." And I just like had to stop for a second and be like, this is so cool. Like, this is such a cool, unique experience. The fact that people wait their whole lives to go to Israel and like we have gone here multiple times and like got to experience this so many times with people that are experiencing it for their first time. Like that's so special. But also, like the flip side of that too is that you get to experience all these really high highs, but then there are also some really low lows. Like we've visited Kfar Aza and Nativ Asra like before October 7th. And like now afterwards, we take these students to these communities. And as people who have visited those places multiple times before October 7th, that can be incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I think similarly, like what stuck out to me on this trip was just the fact, I mean, we were in Nazareth and like some of these shops were completely closed and had just completely had to shut down because there's just no more tourism. And then also there was one restaurant that our students went to where they opened up a new thing of shawarma just for us because we were the only people that they'd gotten that day. And I think when you go from seeing it, I mean, we've been with Passages for a long time. COVID was like there was no trips going. Like there's multiple blows to the sort of tourism industry that Israel and other countries around the world have had to face. But it's so interesting to see and heartbreaking to see how these communities have had to handle things since October 7th. And on the one hand, it's very hard to see and difficult to watch a country that you care about so much go through something so difficult. But also on the flip side of that, it was really special to watch them light up when they saw this like massive group of students coming and they're hungry and they want food. And they were just so eager and excited to be able to serve them and prepare that food for them. And that just was really sweet to watch all of these students really. There were a couple bus drivers that I saw having conversations with the students, telling them, explaining to them the situation, why these people were so excited to serve them. And they, I think, really took that to heart and took that very personally, that it was like a thing that they were getting to participate in that they didn't take for granted either, which I thought was really, really special. Yeah, so that's something I learned. I would love to know more about what you learned as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you shared was amazing. I love all the things that you're thinking about and that you learned through your work with our students as well. I mean, a big part of what you're doing is telling the story of what our student experience is like. So you have a lot of very unique insights, I think, because you spend so much time with them. That story about them mouthing, this is so cool, and what that means, I think, is pretty special. I'm really glad that you got to experience that. There were a few, I think, interesting moments. Some of them for me were profound, and some of them were pretty mundane in the moment, at least. But then looking back on it, realized, okay, this is actually pretty interesting in terms of what it's telling me about Israeli society right now. And I'll give you a couple examples. One, I had Shabbat dinner with a family in Jerusalem, and throughout the course of the evening, didn't actually put this together until at some point they were explaining what synagogue they belonged to, and showing names of a couple of families that also attend that synagogue. And as I put it together, I realized, oh, okay, I know this person, just met with them last week, or I know this person. I had Shabbat dinner with them a few years ago. One of them, the Poland Goldberg family, Poland family, I should say. And that was a interesting kind of small world moment. I think it reminded me of just how small a country Israel is, how tight-knit the community is. I mean, you can easily meet people who are connected to virtually everyone else in the country, only removed by 2 or 3 degrees typically, if you just spend enough time there. And it reminded me, I think, of the value of spending time over a meal with the people who live there, getting to know them, hearing their stories, understanding their connections, because I found that was very meaningful to connect with a family who was friends with families that I had had dinner with previously, particularly given the fact that the families they knew were families that had been extremely traumatized by October 7, the loss of children, other loved ones. And it was very special, I think, to just be reminded of, again, how many people in the country experienced October 7 in very visceral ways, and how interconnected and tight-knit Israeli society is. I think it's very different than the United States. One of the common themes that I've heard repeatedly from students coming back from the trip is, wow, Israel is so much more unified and tight-knit as a society than the States is. They understand their why, what makes Israel Israel, what makes an Israeli an Israeli. And it's not just common enemies, it's also a sense of shared collective identity that honestly we don't have a lot of in the United States. We're a pretty fractured, divided society right now, unfortunately. So that, I think, was a really interesting sort of observation, the chance to again, think about the importance of like real relationships when you're engaging with people
Yeah.
from different cultures, but also the opportunity to put our own society up to a mirror and kind of self-reflect a little bit and think about that was really quite interesting. Some of the more, I guess, mundane observations, just kind of side comments here and there that were maybe a little bit less profound in the moment, but also, again, meaningful the more I thought about it. When I landed at Ben Gurion Airport, I did not realize how many planes the United States has just had parked there
Hmm.
since February 28th, or even a little bit before that. And it was really quite interesting as I then traveled throughout the country and talked to different people about how do you feel about the Iran war and where it's headed and all of this and that. What I didn't expect to hear as often as I did is we'd really like to have our airport back, which was
Hmm.
really
Wow.
interesting, really quite interesting that many Israelis are disappointed, not just in the direction that the war has gone, but the fact that they feel kind of stuck in this limbo.
Hmm.
I do think this is starting to change a little bit with the deal coming out, which we'll discuss in a couple minutes. But when I was there wasn't a deal yet. And so they were kind of just describing this feeling of being in limbo where we don't have access to our airport as much as we would like. We have long waits at the airport. We don't have as many flights available to us. We have to reserve a certain amount of landing and takeoff windows for the US Air Force. And it's had like a noticeable impact on their society, whether that's lack of ability to travel or a harder time at the airport or higher prices on plane tickets or whatever it may be. The general inconvenience of hosting the United States Air Force and not really having a choice in the matter was really
Hmm.
quite interesting hearing them describe that. The sentiment, I think, when I dug a little bit deeper into that and was asking some questions about, okay, but is it worth it? You know, if we're fighting this war alongside you, a lot of them I think are concerned that the war is not necessarily producing the outcome that they expected. And they're frustrated not just with minor inconveniences like the airport. That's not a minor inconvenience, but comparatively speaking, it is minor when you compare it to other challenges that they face, like the number of reserve call-ups. That's a big
Yep.
deal. The fact that some of these people have spent, you know, more than half of their time over the last 2 or 3 years in the reserves fighting conflicts, whether it be in Gaza or in Lebanon or wherever it may be, the psychological toll of that nearly 3 years of fighting now is pretty significant. The sense that it needs to end so that people can relax, I think, never mind the other things that they would like to have, like cheaper flights or cheaper gas or whatever. The sense of like constantly being on edge for nearly 3 years and never being able to relax, it eventually has a pretty significant effect on not just individuals, but on society as a whole. And having to spend some time there, having to problem solve several things because of various security challenges that presented themselves, I kind of get that. I mean, we only had to deal with it for a week, but if you're dealing with that sense of uncertainty and constant vigilance for nearly 3 years, yeah, at some point you just get fed up with it and say, I really want this to be over. And so there definitely was a sense for many of the people I was talking to, the problem isn't really the planes parked at the airport, it's what they represent. That as long as the planes are there, but are put in park and aren't actually flying some sort of operation, they're just kind of stuck waiting for the next round of conflict. And the war
Hmm.
isn't really over, it's just kind of on pause. And that's not really much better than the war being actively fought from their perspective. Most Israelis, I think, are convinced that no matter who you blame, unfortunately, it also seems to them that the United States and Israel are no longer on the same page about the war. And frankly, I think that's true. I mean, at some point, our interests have been very closely aligned, but we're never totally aligned. And at the moment, it definitely seems like they're diverging a little bit. And that is interesting to observe the process of decoupling a little bit after we were so close
Yeah.
at the beginning of the spring. And that process could be messy. It could be, I think, painful, honestly. It seems like they view the current status quo of approaching this Iran deal as a temporary solution that isn't really good enough. Maybe it works for the United States, but they kind of feel like they're being left out of the process and it's not really going to be good for them. And like I said, I think that makes sense. I don't think they're wrong about that, that's sort of the direction things seem to be heading a little bit. And I'm not arguing for or against that, but I think it does have the potential to be messy and a little bit awkward and
Hmm.
painful over the course of the next few months as we sort of figure out what a post-war status quo is going to look like if it doesn't mean that they actually get relief from the prospect that fighting could resume very quickly. So that's a lot. I should probably stop there. But anything else you want to add, Olivia, before we turn our attention to this crazy Iran MOU business?
Not yet, but I have a feeling I'll have questions for you as we progress.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump into that. I think I'll give you a few thoughts, and then I'm sure we can talk about a lot. Credit to Olivia for bringing up this question before we started recording, and I think it's a good thing for us to try to unpack a bit. What exactly is going on here? Is this a deal? Is this not a deal? What exactly is an MOU? Memorandum of Understanding. Great questions. We're going to jump into that and see where the conversation takes us. So I would say this, at the moment, we still don't know a whole lot because American and Iranian officials, even after various leaks claiming to, have a copy of the MOU, American and the Iranian officials are still making contradictory claims to the media about it, whether certain provisions are included or not, whether the leaks are accurate or not, whether it has been officially agreed to or even signed or not, whether there is still more work to be done before it is officially approved. There's a lot that is still pretty unclear at this point. Copies were leaked yesterday, or purported copies were released yesterday. I still haven't seen anything that has like an official stamp on it, the logo of the White House or something like that. So I have to reserve some of my judgment about this document until I can actually read a copy that I'm confident is an official copy and not a partial draft of it or something like that. But a few observations about it. It is an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, not a treaty or a permanent agreement. There's a lot of debate online about, is this an MOU or is this a deal? And the answer is kind of both. I mean, it is an agreement of sorts, but it's a interim agreement designed to get you to a permanent agreement or deal, something like a treaty or permanent agreement between our two countries. What is agreed to at this point is considered binding in the sense that you have to follow through on these things if we're going to proceed to the next step. There are conditions. If you do not, then we don't proceed to the next step. But it is also highly conditional. I mean, it could fall apart at any given point. There are few enforcement mechanisms. If one side says, we don't want to keep doing this, then the only real consequence is the deal falls apart. That's kind of how an MOU works. It is not ratified by any other body like the UN Security Council or the US Senate. A permanent agreement likely would be. I mean, one thing that does seem pretty clear at this point is that somewhere in the MOU, there is a stipulation that a permanent agreement would be ratified by the UN Security Council. The US Senate, under our Constitution, would also be required to ratify a new treaty or permanent agreement with Iran as well. So there are some differences between what's being signed this week and what a permanent end to the conflict would look like, or a permanent arrangement, agreement, treaty, whatever term you want to use, would look like. It does seem to focus very heavily on the Strait of Hormuz. It establishes a 60-day window to negotiate the really tricky stuff, like nuclear weapons and sanction relief in exchange for some nuclear controls. So basically, it sort of punts on the really big stuff and tries to go after some of the low-hanging fruit to get started, to generate some momentum towards negotiating on the really hard stuff. This is not that unusual. I mean, it's highly criticized, of course, in different parts of American media. But if you think about the history of any like big negotiations like these, it's actually fairly typical that you start small and then you build up towards the bigger issues. So that didn't necessarily surprise me that much. I think it is important to clarify that this is essentially an agenda for what still needs to be negotiated. Like a part of this MOU is an arrangement or an agreement about some issues that do matter, like the Strait of Hormuz and shipping through it and that sort of thing. But a big chunk of this MOU, presumably, is an agenda for what still needs to be negotiated. That is also fairly standard for negotiations at this level and with these stakes, that you have to negotiate what you are allowed to negotiate about. That sounds very tedious. It is, but it's just part of the process when you're negotiating at this level. The really big concern, it seems like, in the MOU, and again, not having read an official copy, I don't know exactly the veracity of these concerns, but the concern would be how much leverage is the United States giving away by sequencing financial incentives the way that this MOU apparently does. What I mean by that is how quickly are you releasing certain sanctions or providing an investment fund to help rebuild key infrastructure in Iran, or releasing frozen assets or financial assets, money held in banks in Qatar, for example. How quickly are you doing that, and what steps does Iran have to take before the United States takes each of those steps to give financial leverage back to Iran? That's pretty key. I mean, that matters a lot because it presumably would have a pretty significant impact on how those like big picture negotiations over the really important stuff go if the United States is giving leverage away before those negotiations actually start. So there's a lot there. Barring any changes, I think this preliminary MOU is supposed to be signed. Initially, they said Friday in Switzerland. Now they're saying maybe it'll be signed remotely because of some security concerns. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. We'll know by the end of the week if it's been signed on schedule and where and how and all those fun details. But yeah, there's been a lot of really interesting coverage of this week. Olivia, do you have any reactions to all of that or anything that you want to share?
I have so many reactions to it. I'll start with one though. So the Lebanon situation, there's
Right.
been a lot of talk. Israel apparently has not seen this MOU at all. And yet according to word on the street, leaked documents, quote unquote, how verifiable those are, we're not sure. But according to these leaked documents, it looks like part of the agreement will be that Israel will have to withdraw from Lebanon and a whole bunch of other things. Do you think that point, because I mean, I think even as of today, obviously Hezbollah has been launching drones into Israel and rockets into Israel during this entire process. But even today, I believe Iran was threatening that if Israel doesn't stop its attacks in southern Lebanon, that it is going to retaliate. Do you think that could be a point at which this whole thing could break down?
Potentially. It's hard to say. The wording of this memorandum of understanding, even the leaked copies that I've seen, is pretty ambiguous in certain ways, probably intentionally so. And that may have been done in order to provide some flexibility regarding this issue. For example, Israel is not mentioned directly, but in some of the leaked copies, there is reference to both sides and their allies agree to cease operations or whatever. Probably what they mean by that, what Iran means by that, is that Israel has to withdraw from Lebanon, but Israel's not specifically mentioned. So there is some degree of deniability, particularly given that Israel was not involved in the process of negotiating this and hasn't seen a copy yet. Israel's not likely to leave Lebanon just because there's some vague reference to U.S. allies in this document.
Yeah.
Is Iran going to retaliate? Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't get the impression that they're likely to totally destroy this deal over it, because if the leaked copies are accurate, this is a pretty good deal for Iran, a very good deal, actually. I think what's more likely is that Iran is going to use some of the money that it would get back as part of this deal in order to strengthen Hezbollah and to help it recover from a pretty nasty war against Israel over the last couple of years. The big picture, I think what this MOU means in terms of the implications is that we started this process a few months ago with Israel and the United States saying that one of the primary objectives of the war is that Iran be forced to give up its terror proxies and its support for them. Iran has managed to successfully make Lebanon, which has been trying to basically get out of a situation in which it's a client state of Iran, or more specifically, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran has managed to basically flip that and basically say, no, we're holding on to Lebanon as a client state and Hezbollah as one of our proxies or our clients. And we intend to not only maintain the status quo, but double down on our investment in them. And we expect the United States to basically give us permission to do so. The deal, as is leaked, again, the leaked copies, doesn't really suggest that there's an intent to do anything about that, because the proxies are really not on the list of items that still need to be negotiated. The big priorities are the nuclear program in terms of what's on the agenda for next step negotiations. So the implication or the likely outcome of all of this is not necessarily that Iran tanks the process over Israel's role in Lebanon, but that Iran takes the opportunity to double down on its commitment to relationship with and its investment in organizations like Hezbollah, because it won't be punished for doing so unless something changes during the next step of negotiations.
Okay, that makes sense. I think another question I had for you is Trump's rhetoric about all of this, to me, as just somebody who's been watching, has been kind of confusing. Him, for example, saying that critiquing Israel's actions in Lebanon, implying that they're destroying civilian buildings like wantonly, essentially, and saying that Syria should handle Hezbollah as if Syria would be any more friendly than Israel would be.
Right.
That saying originally that he, was going to go in, get all the nuclear dust, now saying that it's somewhat of a non issue. That rhetoric to me feels confusing in comparison to where we were at the beginning of Rising Lion and how hardline he was on a lot of these issues. I would just be curious to know, is this confusing to you too? Is there something I'm not seeing? What's the issue on that?
Yeah, I think rhetoric is a tool of negotiation. We have to remember that. So when very strong statements are made, sometimes they are meant, and other times they're really a tool of trying to, draw a line in the sand and say, this is my starting negotiating position. And everyone understands that you're going to move from that position at some point. I think that's probably true of a lot of what President Trump has said over the course of the last few months, is that he's been trying to put pressure on people to reach some sort of negotiation or negotiated agreement or negotiated outcome. And he has allowed there to be a certain amount of confusion because that serves his purpose. If your opponent is not sure what you actually want, but is feeling pressure, then you gain some sort of advantage. It might be a temporary advantage, but it is some advantage in terms of playing this game of chess. And I think if you just look at the number of statements that have been made that do seem to be a little bit kind of all over the place, there definitely is a bit of that. I think that's part of what makes President Trump's strategy work, is that there's a certain degree of unpredictability about it.
Yeah.
It is, I think, it's interesting, and I think poses some interesting challenges to relationships with other countries or allies when they feel like we aren't on the same page anymore. We were on the same page and now we're not. And that's part of the point that I was making earlier, that as long as you have President Trump putting pressure on Israel where there wasn't pressure on Israel a few months ago, can feel challenging. It can feel as though the United States, it no longer has Israel's back, or that Israel does no longer enjoys the favor and favored position that it did a few months ago. And that's painful. That's very, very painful. Tough pill to swallow. And again, I don't want to get into all of the merits of that until we actually see a final copy of this deal and understand what are the actual U.S. foreign policy choices being made. That being said, I'll maybe just make one observation, and that is, or two observations. The U.S.-Israel relationship is still solid and is much stronger than I would say the U.S. relationship with most of its allies, most other countries around the world. It's still a very unique and special relationship. But if anyone thinks that Israel is controlling President Trump right now or is pulling the strings of American foreign policy, the last couple of weeks is a pretty clear indicator that that could not be farther from the truth. I mean, Israel's pretty upset about this. That doesn't mean President Trump is wrong, but it does mean that Israel's not the one in charge right now. And the idea that there's some grand conspiracy that Israel is controlling the U.S. government is just laughable at this point.
Interesting. Yeah, I think similarly to you, I've had a few people reach out and ask for my opinion on it, and I've just kind of held off on judgment because I think that until we actually know what's in the agreement, which I heard somebody say, I think it was Vance the other day, say that it's only like 1.5 pages, which is just also so interesting to me that we're, talking about the
It's 14
potential
points. So if it really is just the 14 points, the 1.5 pages is about right. Yeah.
Yeah, which I just, when you think about it in the context of like the world's leading sponsor of global state terrorism and nuclear proliferation being, obviously this is the preamble to like the rest of the negotiations, but it being a page and a half is just like such a crazy concept. But I obviously want to like hold off on any judgment because I also think that you and I just have like the occupational hazard of holding out hope until we know otherwise, which I think is always a great thing to do. But I think the only other question I had for you is Trump made a Trump tweeted something the other day and said something along the lines of like, the Iranian regime has told me that they're no longer interested in seeking a nuclear weapon. They no longer want nukes. What do you think the thought process is? Because it's the same thing that they told the Obama administration when we signed the JCPOA. What do you think the difference is here in why we would believe what they're saying when we've been given no reason to believe that anything that they've said prior about their goals for nuclear proliferation have been accurate?
Well, there's a couple different ways of looking at this. One of two things is true, and I honestly don't know which was which at the moment. The first option is that the Trump administration has found someone, and they claimed during the early stages of the war, especially after some of the very high-profile assassinations, that they were on the hunt for someone reasonable, a person who could think rationally, who was not a pure ideologue, and who was capable of rallying support for some sort of rational agreement, someone who could think about what is necessary to actually govern Iran and build it up into a great society and not waste its resources on something like a nuclear weapons program. Maybe they found someone. Option A is that they found someone who is that person, that unicorn, who realizes that it is not worth wasting billions of dollars on a nuclear program that could be spent on other things to invest in Iranian society and good governance of that country. And if that's the case, fantastic. Maybe there is a light at the end of the tunnel here. Option B is that the Trump administration, and I would say most specifically, the person who's making these comments most regularly is Vice President Vance, who's been really kind of the face of this deal, selling it on television all day, every day, a lot of interviews, a lot of press, because he's been pretty invested in. And if you believe most of the reporting, he's really been the person who was like pushing this deal to happen. Whereas other people, the CIA director, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, a lot of other officials around President Trump were saying, we're not really a fan of this idea.
Yeah.
Seems maybe like not a good idea, or our intelligence doesn't actually back this up, or we have doubts. Vice President Vance is the one person who has never really had any doubts, at least publicly, or that have been reported, and is sort of the face of this. Option B, if option A is that President Trump finally found somebody willing to negotiate, option B is that Vice President Vance is incredibly naive. That in the same way that key individuals like John Kerry, for example, under President Obama, were making statements like, we've found the good guys. These people actually want to work with us. They're reasonable, all that sort of thing. Later, some of those statements were proven to be a little bit wishful thinking, a little bit naive. And it's possible that Vice President Vance wants the deal to work so badly that he is being a little bit naive about what Iranians actually want and are willing to sacrifice in order to make it happen. Only time can tell at this point. I mean, I'm not in the room where these negotiations are happening. I don't know these Iranian officials personally, so I really can't say what the truth is. But I think that is sort of the key question is, did they finally find someone to negotiate, or do they just want this to work so badly that they're willing to overlook some red flags? We'll have to wait and see.
Guess we'll know more later. That's all the questions I have for you.
Yeah. Great questions, Olivia. Hopefully these are answering some of the questions that our listeners have as well. I know I also have a bajillion questions. Most of them are the same. I'll just throw one question out there that we didn't really get to today, and that is, why have we not been given an official copy of this? And I think there's some interesting reporting coming out this morning. I was reading that some of the countries involved, Pakistan, for example, Qatar, some of the countries that helped to mediate this agreement or these negotiations are basically requesting that an official copy not be released indefinitely, and that the United States might be considering acquiescing to that request. Gonna be honest, that doesn't make any sense to me, how anyone benefits from not being able to read this document in full. And hopefully that is not true. Those are just rumors, but I have questions too, just like everyone else. So we will have to all wait and see what happens. And I'm sure over the next few weeks, we'll be coming back to this subject. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone for listening. I think hopefully this has been a helpful conversation, and we encourage you all to keep coming back. We'll have some special guests the next couple of weeks, some exciting content. But in the meantime, I appreciate your time, Olivia, also Lindsay, our producer, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Passages seeks to prepare and empower a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit www.passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep you connected to the Pulse.